not confronting the Russian cyber operations and not sharing with allies, that raises concerns that you want to get something for something. And unless it's part of a deal that includes, careful monitoring and making sure the Russians are holding up their end, that, I would expect, unless it's part of such a deal, that Putin is going to take it as, a green light to do what he wants and to accelerate some of the operations that he's doing.
So, Matt, if we can start by going over what measures were put in place by the Biden administration that we know of and which agencies were involved, what exactly are we talking about here?
So we had a variety of efforts to confront what Russia was doing in cyberspace and through hybrid warfare in the Biden administration. One was through Cyber Command, which is controlled by DoD and does more military operations in cyberspace. And then we had on the defensive side of things, we had CISA and other agencies that were trying to combat and deal with Russian cyber attacks. But we also had the National Security Council, which was involved in all those issues. They also had collaborated very closely with some of our allies in order to deal with the Russian threats, both in terms of cybersecurity and some of the attacks that we're seeing on European infrastructure, as well as to deal with threats in the real world, arson and assassinations and targeting, and using intelligence that was, according to reports, using intelligence that was gathered in order to share information and allow allies and partners, particularly in Europe, to deal with those threats. And so we have some reports. I don't know that they've been confirmed about the Trump administration backing away from some of those policies.
Yeah. So in terms of what this tells us then, tell me a little bit more about what you understand about what's potentially been suspended, what implications that has as well.
Yeah, so there were reports that Cyber Command, and I should say that there have been denials of this from the government, but that the American government, but there were reports that Cyber Command was told to suspend offensive operations against Russia, as well as to suspend planning for offensive operations. And so, if this was part of a temporary effort in DoD, to suspend those at a particularly critical moment in negotiations with the Russians over Ukraine, and I think it's understandable. Although I would say if they're suspending planning for operations, I'm not sure why they would need to do that. But I can understand why there might be a temporary suspension of offensive operations. But if it's a lengthy suspension, then that would raise a lot of concerns. There are also reports from CISA that they had been told to deprioritize Russia. They've denied the officials have denied those reports and said they're still paying attention to Russia. But we do have some reason to give these reports credence. There was a State Department official, Deputy Assistant Secretary at a UN forum, who was talking about the countries that represent threats against the US in cyberspace. And this person, he did not name Russia, that was a noticeable absence. I can tell you that when US officials talk about the actors in the states that are engaging in very disturbing behavior in terms of cyber attacks and cyber intrusions, it includes China, Iran, North Korea, but it always includes Russia. And so to leave it out did suggest that at least some in the administration are looking at a different approach where we would not confront Putin in the same way in cyberspace.
Isn't that interesting? It's more about what isn't said and what's left out than what is. It kind of harks back to the meeting that we had last week between Trump and Putin. It was kind of what was coming out of the Kremlin and the White House. It was like, where are the gaps in the information that we're getting? It tells us a little bit more about what is actually being confirmed.
Yeah, and it does suggest that the Trump administration is trying to take a different approach with Russia. I would say that certainly, we all are all supporters of reaching an accommodation in Ukraine, particularly one that Ukraine, would agree to and see as in its interest. And so, it's okay to try things out, but I think that to the extent that there are concerns that the Trump administration is doing unilateral disarmament, for instance, they're not getting anything for not confronting the Russian cyber operations and not sharing with allies, that raises concerns that you want to get something for something, and unless it's part of a deal that includes careful monitoring and making sure the Russians are holding up their end, that I would expect unless it's part of such a deal that Putin is going to take it as a green light to do what he wants and to accelerate some of the operations that he's doing, because he'll conclude that the U.S. doesn't care, particularly about cyber attacks and on European infrastructure and other things. So I think it raises very serious concerns.
Yeah, well, let's move on to that. The serious concerns. If you were Putin, how can this be exploited?
So I think that in terms of some of the real world, beyond the cyber attacks, the real world things that the U.S. was working with Europe to try to prevent arson and assassination attempts, for instance, against executives that work at companies that are manufacturing equipment that's useful in Ukraine. I would take it as a sign that the U.S. isn't going to help our allies and partners, and so he may try to accelerate some of those efforts and see if he can accomplish more and see if the U.S. doesn't respond. And I think in terms of the whole panoply of operations that the Russians engage in cyberspace, I think it would be he may take it as a sign that he should ramp up those activities, and that includes you could talk about attacks on critical infrastructure, but that also includes efforts to use cyberspace in order to benefit the Russian economy. Things like ransomware attacks at hospitals that generate revenue for cyber criminal groups in Russia that may share some of the proceeds with the Russian government. So I think he'd want to test things and see if he can authorize more of that and see if there's no response from the U.S.
It's what we've spoken about, the concerns and the level of concern. President Trump has argued the conflict in Ukraine has the potential to spiral into World War III. So, arguing that and having improved relations with Russia are in America's strategic interest. How is this? I know we're not talking about necessarily confirmation of all these. These are concerns and fears with a dose of intelligence from sources. But in terms of the president arguing that, how is it being greeted in US circles? That's the argument to counter it. So it should be. He's doing this in America's interest and Ukraine's interest.
So I think that it depends on which circles you're talking about. I think that certainly in some Republican circles, there's a desire to take a different approach and to see if we can reach some sort of accommodation with Russia. I think that others in Washington share the similar view in the sense that yes, it would be great if we could reach an agreement in Ukraine that would establish a ceasefire and perhaps even establish a peace agreement. But that ultimately, with someone like Putin, you really need to take a firm view and you need to confront him about his behavior and really make sure that when you're negotiating a deal that you communicate to him that you understand everything he's doing that's concerning and that it's all going to have to be part of some sort of agreement in order to avoid having cyber attacks or other behaviors that he's engaging in get worse. And so I think everyone supports these negotiations, and let's see if we can take an approach where Russia would play a more constructive role in Europe, but we can't do that unless we're realistic about what Russia is already engaging in, and unless we're willing to confront them about that and make sure that we're going to have an agreement that we monitor what they're doing and that we have ways to ensure that they're going to comply. And so, I think that there's a bit of concern that the way that this is being negotiated so far, that there's the lack of confronting them on those issues or calling them out when they're engaging in behavior that's concerning.
And the level of concern, if I could just finally ask you about the level of concern that there are fears that the Trump administration deprioritizing these issues despite intelligence warnings. So, anything that's being said is going against anything, that the intelligence community is telling the Trump administration. How concerned should we be about that?
So it's not clear because we're not privy to some of these conversations. Certainly in the past, the president, as well as others in the administration, have cast doubt on certain intelligence reports that painted Russia as a threat. And so that does suggest that at least some in the administration have an approach to things where they tend to discount intelligence that would suggest that Russia is a problem. But there are also clearly people in the administration at the National Security Council and at the intelligence agencies who recognize the threat that Russia poses and who will be looking for opportunities to highlight that behavior and to persuade people in the administration that they need to take a serious tack. And so, ultimately, how this all plays out remains to be seen. But it's going to be a dynamic process in the White House and among the departments and agencies about how seriously we take this and whether we're able to overcome some of that skepticism that we've seen by some in the administration about how much of a threat that Russia poses.